Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Angela Puca, and welcome to the live stream symposium. As you know, I'm a PhD and a religious studies scholar, and this is your online resource for the academic study of magic, esotericism, paganism, shamanism, and all things occult. Today, we have a very special guest that I will introduce in just a second. But before we start, allow me to remind you that this project can only exist thanks to your support. So if you have the means and can help at all, please consider supporting my work with a one-off PayPal donation by joining memberships or my inner symposium on Patreon. You find all the links in the info box and in a pinned comment. So yeah, otherwise, like, share, subscribe, and share the academic fun around, because this is how our symposium grows and how we can have amazing guests such as the one that we have today. So allow me to introduce to you guys our fantastic guest, Julian Strube. Am I pronouncing your name right?
Oh yeah, perfect.
I should have asked before.
Oh, that's fine. Don't worry about it.
I met Julian for the first time last time at the SUNY conference. That is the conference of the European Society for the Study of Western Esotericism. We academics tend to use the acronyms, and sometimes I have to remind myself to also spell it out for people that are not familiar with our terminology. So we met and we had a conversation about his upcoming book that you also presented at the last conference, called Global Tantra. And so we will talk about that, but also about a few other things that Julian is researching. So first of all, thank you so much for being here and accepting to be a guest on Angela's Symposium.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
How do you feel today, Julian?
Oh, I'm good. I'm good. The teaching is supposed to start tomorrow this semester, so it's going to be pretty busy, but I'm looking forward to it. It's a nice start.
Is it the second semester?
Yeah, it's the summer already. It's the timing here is a bit weird in Austria.
Yeah, because it's different here in the UK, the way the semester works.
Yeah.
Now it's like the middle of the second semester. So
yeah. No, tomorrow everything is going to kick off. At least for me, like on the 1st of March, and my events are all on Monday. So tomorrow.
That's good. Also, thank you, Andrew, for moderating the chat. So I guess let's crack on with the content, because we have a ton to discuss. So in your book, Global Tantra, and more generally in your research, you discuss a new global historical approach to the study of esotericism. So could you please expand more on that? What is this new approach that you are recommending and offering to the public, and in what ways does it differ from the usual approach, the usual methodology that has been used so far for studying esotericism?
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing this up. So indeed, this is a relatively new perspective, at least in the study of esotericism, but it comes out of my religious studies background. So in religious studies, we have this perpetual problem of what is religion. Your viewers will most likely be a bit familiar with that question, but it's probably also important to explain that from a religious studies perspective, you do not want to be normative. You do not want to say something is a correct or a wrong religion, or a good or a bad religion. You want to understand what religion is. And recent decades have brought a lot of discussions about the notion of religion itself. You know, like when the discipline emerged, let's say in the 19th century, we had this standard understanding of religion as something universal, a kind of human faculty that exists in all places, that has existed at all times, and that manifests perhaps differently in different historical contexts, but essentially, like literally the essence, like there's a religious essence that is always the same. And this kind of view and the related approaches have been criticized for many decades. And by now, most scholars, never everybody, but most scholars would agree that, we have to look at it in specific historical contexts, and we must not generalize. We must not understand it from a scholarly perspective. Practitioner perspectives are something else, perhaps. But from a scholarly perspective, we should not see it as something having an essence, a fixed meaning, but something that really depends on historical context. And then you had an increasing awareness of the fact that this notion, religion, was applied, especially in the 19th century, but also before, to other cultures, let's say to non-European cultures within a colonial context. So there was a lot of different people arguing that if we talk about religion in a non-European, non-Western context, that is some kind of, perpetuation, a continuation of this colonial forcing of European categories to the rest of the world, some kind of at least epistemic violence, like a violence in thought. You're forcing a concept to another context. And of course, it was also concomitant with actual colonial violence, so we must be very careful and so on. And the idea behind this global historical perspective is to avoid these two extremes that go hand in hand with this historical development. So on one hand, we, and I speak in the plural because it's really a group of people who are discussing this in the religious studies context. So we want to avoid this classical phenomenological, as you often call it, essential understanding of religion. But also, on the other hand, this idea that you often have in some post-colonial contexts that everything is just a colonial imposition. It's a Western invention. For instance, this also a very complex debate about Hinduism. Is Hinduism and a Western and orientalist invention? Has it been made up in the 18th and 19th century? And does the same apply to religion? We want to avoid that because there again, you have this focus on Western people, like Western people doing stuff, and a little or almost no interest often in local context, where of course people were not the passive recipients of Western knowledge, but they engaged with it. They engaged with it in their local context, and these contexts, of course, also have a very long history. If we stick to India, because that's roughly where we'll be moving around in our conversation, I guess. So in India, especially, you have these long histories of intercultural exchanges, including the Mughals, for instance, the Muslim emperors who ruled over the subcontinent. For a very long time, you had exchanges well into antiquity to the Mediterranean and so on. So it was not a static cultural fixed atmosphere at any point, but always very dynamic, very culturally dynamic. And this leads us to esotericism. So it's basically the same problem. You have this, let's say, leading paradigm, like the major field of study where research on esotericism happens. And that's Western Esotericism. You were mentioning the society, the European Society for the Study of Western Esotericism. That is where most expertise on the subject of esotericism, whatever it may be precisely, is bundled, and where most of this research is being published and so on, focusing on it. I'm getting to the point where I complicate that as well, but most of the decidedly esoteric focused research is happening there. And this notion, Western esotericism, if you look at it historically, comes from a context in the 19th century where you had initially, especially French esotericists who were self-consciously resurrecting what they considered a specific esoteric tradition. And they opposed that to especially the Theosophical Society and their understanding of esotericism, which was predominantly Buddhism and Hinduism focused. So these French people said, we are the representatives of Western esotericism. That is, of course, superior esotericism. It has a specific lineage that at the time was basically constructed. And similar things happened also in the English-speaking context. Even within Theosophy, you had these quarrels, which kind of occultism is better. For instance, Rudolf Steiner famously left the Theosophical Society, among other things, because of that, claiming that, we have to focus on esoteric Christianity and Western esotericism and these kinds of things. So this is where the notion comes from. And in France, we also have the first institutionalization of the study of esotericism. And there again, you have Western esotericism as the basic concept. Antoine Fabre is very famously the pioneer in that respect. Of course, that also didn't come out of nowhere, but he is clearly like a leading name in that. And not coincidentally, that the sources that he included to discuss Western esotericism are exactly that kind of French tradition of Western esotericism. And it's no secret, it's very transparently discussed in recent publications that he had an insider interest, what sometimes is called religionist. Basically unapologetically saying, like, this is my personal belief, this is my conviction, I'm a practitioner, and so on, which developed in the succeeding years in a more historical empirical approach. And that is basically the standard in the study of esotericism since the 90s. And in the same course with that development, you have the shift of this notion, Western esotericism, from this insider concept to a historical, empirical, heuristical device, let's call it like that, that is supposed to highlight the Western specificity of this construct. And it's kind of a maneuver that was done there, because it was kind of pretended that this dichotomy that is inherent to Western esotericism does not exist anymore. Of course, it still is very much obvious in the logic, since the name is Western esotericism. And the focus or the emphasis from that point on was, we do not mean a universalist under esotericism. And this is the crux, like, this is the most important aspect. It was kept as a demarcation to avoid religionist, universalist understandings. If you recall what I just said about old school religious studies approaches that assume that there is an essence religion that manifests differently at different times and places. And the same that has been discredited in religious studies at that point should be discredited in the study of esotericism. We don't want universalism. We don't want essentialism. We don't want religionalism. We want this historical approach. But this inner contradiction of Western esotericism that has not been resolved so far. And I would say that the one very fruitful way of doing that is to historicize this notion of esotericism itself, which is what I would also say for religion. And there the starting point is to acknowledge, okay, today, clearly this is a globally used notion. And people across the world, they identify as esoteric, they discuss esotericism, and significantly, we have vast areas of scholarship that do use esoteric in their scholarly vocabulary, most famously perhaps esoteric Buddhism. So for reasons that we can discuss, there is a de facto part of scholarship that does Eastern esotericism, if you will, by discussing subjects like esoteric Buddhism, whatever that may be. It's one of these terminologies. Subjects like Daoism, alchemy in that context, for instance, subjects like Tantra that are often overlapping. There's even a whole debate if it's not tantric Buddhism rather than esoteric Buddhism. But what I mean to say is that if we look at reality, there is scholarship dealing with esotericism in Asia. And it's completely disconnected from Western esotericism. And there are many problems related to that come from, or basically that are problems because the current narratives that we have, the paradigms and the methodology to look at the sources is flawed. That's what I would argue, because it has this preconceived template of Western esotericism that is then used to take source material and to make it fit the narrative, not the other way around. So it's a top-down narrative that determines how we read and how we select the sources. And that's what I want to complicate. Why is it called global? Because if we go back and ask ourselves the question, where does it come from? Like, why are people, like, why are experts on Asia talking about esoteric Buddhism? There must be a reason for that, right? There also must be a reason why we have these different practices and teachings as a result of clearly cross-cultural transfers, cultural exchanges. You can, like stumble in any kind of direction and land in a yoga studio, for instance. Yeah, that there must be a historical reason for that as well. That basically leads us to sources that predate this whole 19th century discourse, as you have it, for instance, in occultism, Eliphas Levi and all these authors, Theosophy, which only emerged quite late as a society in 1875. So if we go back more to the 19th century, we discover something quite fascinating. So that's one of these articles that you kindly put in the description. It's not out yet, but it should be soon. And what I did there is to ask why was esoteric an omnipresent vocabulary in Orientalist scholarship in the 18th century? Because that was the case. I did my dissertation, my second book, on the French occultist context. But in the historical context of Catholicism and Socialism, and that at the time had a lot to do with this awakened interest in the Orient, the emergence of historical critical Bible scholarship, for instance, of Orientalist studies. So people were obsessed with this question of origins and where does religion come from. And this is the background against which people were getting interested in esoteric. So in things esoteric, things referenced as esoteric. So when I did this contextualization of Eliphas Levi, that was kind of my focal point for the dissertation. I saw that all these sources that he used from Orientalist scholarship, they were talking about like the origin of things esoteric, occult, arcane, in India, in China, in Japan, and in the Orient, the Magi, of course, Persia. And if you trace that back to the 18th century and before, you will find that it's in an abundance of sources completely normal to talk about things esoteric and occult, to identify the Kabbalah of the Sufis and the Kabbalah of the yogis, which kind of are supposedly belonging together. And what I want to get at is not the claim that there was some kind of universal esotericism that was identified by these sources. That is not my conviction from this historical perspective. But as a religious studies scholar, I'm interested in why these comparisons were made and how things were called certain things, identified with each other, equaled with each other, and how the respective actors who were supposedly practicing certain things were exchanging ideas and practices. And it's no secret that, or let's put it like this, it's a common accepted knowledge in the study of esotericism and Western esotericism that we have the 18th century as a crucial period where this understanding of esotericism is kind of shaped, right? So also semantically, we have the emergence of certain nouns in 1828, Esotericism by a French orientalist.
A lot of people don't know that the term esotericism is very recent. The term esoteric is very ancient, but the term esotericism is quite recent, actually, but most people don't know that.
Yeah, it's the time of the isms. Many isms come from the 18th century and then also the 19th century. So the isms are formed in a context, and this is where it now gets interesting, where if you look at existing scholarship, for instance, Monika Neugebauer-Wölk, a German historian, has extensively worked on this particular context, the 18th century. You will see that she worked with sources that she identified as Masonic, like from the sphere of Freemasonry. And it's true, these authors, they were very often Freemasons, and they were interested in Pythagoreanism, as it was very fashionable at the time in Freemasonry, and Hermeticism, of course. There's a complicated story related to that, but the crucial point is that we have the argument developed by Neugebauer-Wölk and others that at that time we have the emergence of what was called a Western esoteric corpus. And our colleagues looked at the sources clearly with the preconception of Western esotericism in mind, and identifying exactly the kind of sources that you would expect, like the Rosicrucians, the Theosophers in the sense of Jakob Böhme, Swedenborg, Kabbalah, Paracelsianism, alchemy, like these kinds of things, where you would say, oh yeah, that's what I understand as esotericism. Makes sense, Western esoteric corpus. But if you then look at more than the snapshot, if you look at the entire writing, the entire volumes, for instance, you will see, well, actually, at least as much, if not sometimes more of the discussion revolves around Japan and China and India and Persia. And then you perhaps do another step and you ask yourself, okay, who again is the author? Yeah, a member in a Freemasonic lodge, which, we would be hard pressed in these university professor circles not to find a Freemason in certain contexts, So of course, yes, they were Freemasons, but they happened to occupy a chair for Orientalist studies, or they were experts in Orientalist studies, which at some point meant more something like Persian, Arabic, and Hebrew, and then increasingly, since the end of the 19th century, also Sanskrit and Pali and other South Asian languages. So it's not simply wrong to say, oh yeah, those were Masonic authors, and of course it is super relevant for these discussions, but to say, okay, this is a Western esoteric corpus, is the immediate result. I really find this very strikingly clear. The immediate result of a preconceived template that you have, that you apply to the sources, and there you say, okay, there we go, confirmation of this concept, which comes from the 19th century and which we have never really interrogated. So this is where it gets interesting. And of course, now we have been talking about Orientalist scholarship, and what I have done in the book, like in the Tantra book, is to really dive into this local Indian context. And again, this is where the global perspective comes in. The global perspective is concerned with several things. It's concerned with doing old school, hardcore philological source work in specific contexts, in languages that are not European, and contextualizing that by first relating local developments to these global connections that shape them. And that in the case of Bengal, for instance, can be traced back for centuries. And to do that, now I've kind of preempted it, to do that both synchronically at the same time and diachronically riding through the centuries, if you will, and the ambition is to say, we are really reconstructing this development you call this genealogical. You see, you try to understand how certain things have attained a certain meaning, and you start in the present by destabilizing this meaning that we taken for granted, and that will almost guaranteed look very different if we have done our historical source work. So you relate the global to the local, you relate a synchronic contextualization to diachronic developments, and you are writing what is called a decentered historiography, or you're doing a decentered historiography, which means that you are not just looking at specific kinds of actors, let's say white European males, but also all kinds of actors that are accessible through the sources. That is a massive problem in its own. It's a big can of worms, our limitations with regard to the sources, but still, in the Indian context, you can do that because of a very rich intellectual landscape and an abundance of sources that you can use. And you're trying to reconstruct how this meaning of esoteric, for instance, came to be. And this is where you land in a situation like my starting point in the 19th century, where you have this meeting between tantrics, Bengali, mostly tantrics, generally from South Asia, but especially Bengali tantrics, and members of the Theosophical Society, and all that in a big tangle of exchanges where Orientalism plays a role, so-called reform, so-called revivalist Hindu movements, exchanges between Persianate, Islamic context and what came to be subsumed under Hindu contexts. Like, these identities also really form at that time. And the crucial point is that they did not form as the result of a unilateral Western diffusion or like an imposition of Western knowledge, but through exchanges, through contestations and struggles and agreements and alliances and rivalries and very, very dynamic developments that are out there in our sources to be scrutinized through a certain lens that does not reproduce established narratives, but tries to complicate them.
And what is your conclusion by using a global perspective to investigate esotericism? Do you think that esotericism can be usefully adopted even for non-Western traditions?
Well, I mean, the first finding is that it is used de facto.
De facto, you mean amicably,
today,
by the practitioners?
Today.
Yeah.
So today, no, not just by practitioners, for instance, also by scholars, like this esoteric vocabulary in, for instance, esoteric Buddhism, but in scholarship on Hinduism, you have the notion of esoteric like all the time. And that has historical reasons that you can study. So I summarized that a bit with that Orientalist scholarship. But also when you then look at the older historical sources, you will also see that people have identified certain things as esoteric. And this is, again, where the religious studies perspective comes in, as I understand it. My step is then not to say, oh, this is wrong, or this is good or bad, or anything like that. I just want to understand how it came to be. It's really a bottom-up approach. I don't have a preconceived idea of what that means. I want to understand how these different historical meanings came to be, in what historical context that was possible to begin with, and who participated in those contexts. And then what is the main implication, or the main implication of this global approach? It was not a one-way street from west to east. It was not just an Orientalist projection. It was a complex historical tangle of exchanges that can only be comprehended if we do have a decentered historiography, and that necessitates moving beyond Europe, beyond North America, beyond what is often subsumed under the West. And in the process, understand also how these identities came to be. Western, Hindu, Muslim, Christian, religious, spiritual, mystical, occult, esoteric. You can study that in the sources. And I would say that we have by now so many examples of how the Western esotericism paradigm, if you will, it's of course more complicated than one paradigm, but you see what I mean, I guess. If not, just ask. Like how this template has been misleading in many ways. It has been helpful in other ways, for instance, by again establishing a certain identity. In this case, a field, like an academic field. But there is now such a huge pile of arguments and of evidence that suggests that it makes sense to move beyond that. And a global approach that, of course, must not look like the stuff I do, but just an expansion of our perspectives can only be good for all kinds of reasons.
Do you still think that Western esotericism, I mean, I agree with you that it is necessary to have a global perspective when it comes to studying esotericism and move beyond the Western perspective. But one thing that I also I personally find it useful, but I don't know if you agree with that the term and the category of Western esotericism feels useful because Western esotericism is something very specific. So if that, there are a certain class of traditions that are clearly identifiable as Western esotericism in my mind. And that doesn't mean that there isn't non-Western esotericism, but it still means to my mind that Western esotericism is still informative as a category to understand a certain class of traditions that have very identifiable traits. So I guess that one thing the two things don't have to be mutually exclusive, because you can have the category of Western esotericism and also the exploration of a global esotericism. I was just wondering what you thought about that.
It's a very important point. And let me first relate it to something I said already quite in the beginning. When I say something like this, a certain terminology is not inherently good or bad, I mean that also with respect to Western esotericism, because it is a historically emerged category. And as such, I do not wish it away. I don't want to make it disappear or anything like that. I just want to understand it, where it comes from. And this is where there is a massive difference between someone taking Western esotericism as a research paradigm that informs what kinds of sources we select and how we read them, and like what we select in those sources. And on the other hand, investigating Western esotericism as a historically emerged notion that is out there to be studied. And of course, I do not want to do away with the latter. That would be nonsensical. That would be nominalist. If I take a religious studies approach seriously, I don't not nominalist. I want to be normative. That's what I meant. Sorry, I don't want to be normative. I just want to understand historically and explain historically. And this is where it gets misleading, because why do you have this preconceived idea about esotericism that is identifiable? You have it because of the scholarship mainly that was done about it. And you have it because the scholarship also reproduced certain narratives, and I would say in some ways uncritically, not categorically uncritically. Of course, there has been a lot of critical discussion, but it's still like the underlying logic, and you can really observe that is something that is being very clinged to, there's a lot of difficulty of complicating the story at the moment, because there is a lot of investment in this paradigm. And I believe that we should be more concerned about unraveling the complexity of the sources and their context than to stick to a certain research paradigm. So that is what I would criticize. And then there's concrete examples, of course, and that leads me again to like the book. The study of theosophy. There you have a very concrete example of how the idea of Western esotericism completely obfuscates our gaze to certain aspects, and that would be the fact that theosophy was not a Western esoteric export to India, to stick to the Indian context. It was not a ready-made concept that, like was transplanted to India and then Indians reacted to it as if they were just parroting Western knowledge. Quite the contrary, like the Theosophists also prior to their relocation to India, which was in 1879, just to give some of the viewers a chronological idea. Prior to that and during that move and after that move, there was no agreement was what esotericism was. Like esotericism in the theosophical context was rarely used to begin with. It was more like the terminology of occultism. There was complete disagreement on what theosophy was supposed to mean. And the society entered an extremely rich and complex intellectual landscape where they were challenged, where they were influenced, where they were confronted with different opinions, with alliances and competitions and rivalries. And you can really show how the understanding of what theosophy was radically transformed in that context. And almost no one has looked at the great number of Indian and other Asian members of the Theosophical Society and interlocutors of the Theosophical Society who participated in that project. So you have this very strong insistence in older scholarship, which in itself is not very old, just we're talking about several years, that this was like an export of Western esotericism, a diffusion, a westernization, and that is another very tangible result of how a research paradigm can limit our gaze, our selection of source material, also what we select, as I said before, within that source material. Nobody was interested in Indian theosophists until recently. That's already in itself telling. And so it's not about destroying something or making something go away and say, oh, that's bad. If you say Western esotericism, you're some kind of like crypto culturalist or whatever. That's not the point. It's about understanding the complexity of historical developments. And these developments are always, really, you can say, like always more complicated than what you hear from certain narratives of like one-sided developments or whatnot. And this complication, I believe, is what I would like to do as a scholar. I don't want to present easy narratives to gather a political following or something like that. I want to be that guy who complicates polarizing and black and white narratives and political identities and any kind of identities. I want to show a history of richness, of exchange, of fluidity, rather than fixed cultures that then clash and these kinds of narratives.
Yeah, I think that probably polarization tends to derive from a lack of complexity. And
yes, always, yeah.
And yeah, I really appreciated your book and how you talked about the influence that theosophy played. So I was wondering, in what ways theosophy shaped our understanding of Indian tradition, but also in what ways Indian traditions were reshaped by theosophy.
So you have this situation where these different actors meet at the end of the 19th century. And the reason why they could enter dialogue so efficiently was what I was summarizing earlier, this orientalist fascination with things esoteric, occult, secret, arcane, and so on, mystical. In the East, great fascination with Sufism, yogi practices, and so on. You really have that, like, basically well into the 16th century, especially 17th century. And of course, you have these earlier, really ancient ideas about India as the font of all wisdom and the gymnosophists. You have that in Greek sources, for instance. And that is where this, what has been called ancient wisdom narrative really comes from. So the idea of the origin of wisdom, and especially exclusive superior wisdom in the East, in India especially, that is in itself very old, and that's also very well known. So there,
do you think that it comes from before Theosophy, or did it?
Very, like, well, definitely. So I mean, the Theosophists were heavily relying on Orientalist scholarship. And what happened in the late 18th century, in 1786 to be precise, there was a very famous philologist, Orientalist named William Jones, who worked in Calcutta, in Northeast India, in Bengal, which is my region, so to speak. He worked in this very rich cultural atmosphere where he was informed by pundits, by Sanskrit, Brahminical, learned scholars, basically. And he discovered, quote unquote, a family relationship between the languages of Sanskrit, ancient Persian, ancient Greek, Latin, and by implication, the modern European languages, which really blew people's mind. For that very fact, it was just fascinating to see that these are apparently, like, related, but also because in the context of the time, 18th century philosophy, there was the assumption that language is an expression of what was often called like an ethnic like nation, in German then Volk, and increasingly throughout the 19th century, race, always quote unquote. And of course, religion is always part of the mix as well. So religion, race, nation, and language are interdependent, which is where these categories come from that were first called Indo-European, especially in the German-speaking countries. Indo-Germanic was very popular.
In Italian there was Indo-European, and I don't know if you know that I studied Sanskrit and Tibetan and also Latin and ancient Greek. And awesome. I remember that when I was studying, because I studied Sanskrit at university and Latin and ancient Greek growing up. And when I started studying Sanskrit at university, it kind of looked like, you could kind of tell that Sanskrit was similar to Greek, to ancient Greek, and Latin was kind of similar to ancient Greek. So with certain words, you can almost perceive the development because you have more consonants in Sanskrit, and they kind of open up with more vowels in ancient Greek and in Latin. So you kind of have that perception. And I remember that our professor of Sanskrit once told us that there was this myth that if you learn Sanskrit, then it would have been easier to learn any other language because it was kind of the root in the European language. Then he said, it's not true, but let's pretend it is because we are here studying Sanskrit. But there was that perception, and that went along with the sense that since it was the root language, then it also meant that it was the root of culture and spirituality. Was that what happened?
Yeah, that was the common assumption. The notion that really explodes in popularity then is the notion of Aryan, which ended up with the Nazis and was inherently linked to their atrocities. So it fell out of use in Europe, at least, not elsewhere, but in Europe after 45, and prior to that, outside of Germany, obviously. But this völkisch sense of a heavily biologized Aryan is a result of a longer development. And I'm talking about this just to remind some of you, because we asked the question, why could the Theosophists and their Indian interlocutors enter this conversation, and why were the Theosophists in India to begin with? I mean, that's not perhaps completely self-evident. So the idea was, since Sanskrit is the oldest of these languages, the origin not only of that, like of the Aryan race, of culture, of like European culture, basically, was to be found in India. And then it really depends on how people look at like what kind of presuppositions they have. One very influential founding figure of religious studies, if you will, Friedrich Max Müller, famous name, he worked in Oxford, was largely responsible for popularizing these ideas of religious categories that map onto those language categories, notably Aryan and Semitic, and who had the idea that there is a pure origin of a universally true religion to be found in ancient India. And that was a conviction shared by very many, including the Theosophists who relied on this kind of Orientalist knowledge. And the way that Indian intellectuals, for instance, engaged with that was highly complex, because already if you go back diachronically, back in time, you're not looking at what happened in the 1850s, for instance, so let's look at developments back to the 1750s, for instance. We see that this whole program of religious studies, of comparative religion, as it was often called, of what Müller then called science of religion, which he translated them himself in vergleichende Religionswissenschaft. It means comparative religious studies, basically, or science of religion more literally. That developed already out of this exchange between intellectuals from across the world, notably a certain Bengali tradition that I worked quite a lot about, the Brahmo Samaj, who were also very close interlocutors of the Theosophists later, but also of someone like Müller and many other contexts. So you have already this whole fundamental idea of a comparative science of religion linked to the idea of an Aryan origin in India, shared by these intellectuals from India and Europe already since the late 18th century. And against that background, the Theosophists think, especially when they read about all these mystical, esoteric, occult practices in the East, they think, well, if you really want to get to the roots of all this, to the source, then we have to go to India. And that resulted in an interesting situation, because I indicated before that this was a very dynamic, very competitive also landscape. You had these rivaling movements and the colonial context, of course, which led to a lot of ambiguity. Because, for instance, on one hand, this role as the old Aryan brothers, the keepers of the ancient roots of Aryan civilization, could be used to claim superiority, to say, indeed, yeah, we know it better than you people. Like, you have your Western modern science, but thousands of years ago, the ancient rishis, the Vedic seers, they already had figured it out. Like, you're just scratching on the surface of what we already knew thousands of years ago. But at the same time, of course, this went hand in hand with the reproduction of like certain racial hierarchies, and it could also go hand in hand with this Orientalist cliche that India is today in a shape of like degeneration, because this culture has fallen, they've become superstitious. Or another cliche, which is very racist as well, is that, yes, this is very old, but it's not superior, it's rather the child stage. And then you have all these Orientalist cliches of the effeminate Indian who is static and detached from modernity and superstitious and so on. So it's very ambiguous, this foundation upon which this exchange could take place. But it was an exceptional situation, and you have that very clearly, explicitly expressed in many sources. You have the situation where Indian actors notice that for the first time, and I'm paraphrasing a source written by a member of the Brahmo Samaj who I mentioned, there was the perception that now for the first time, there is these Europeans who actually come to learn from us, who are not colonial administrators, orientalist scholars, or missionaries who say you're all superstitious, but who actually say you are superior to, for instance, Christianity. There were different positions on that in the Theosophical Society, but somebody like Blavatsky or Alcott, like two of the founding figures and leaders, they would have said that. They would have said, like, Western modernity is bad. It's materialist, it's superficial. Christianity is a denial of the world, which is destructive, for instance. The true roots and also the superior teachings that we have to restore, also to create a unity of science and religion and philosophy, those are to be found in India. And for that reason, Theosophy, like not for that single reason, but it was one major reason for Theosophy's political role in India, where they really became a very significant force. And there are many examples of that. For instance, Annie Besant, who became a president of the Theosophical Society in 1907, became 10 years later also the president of the Indian National Congress, whose founding history was already linked to someone like Alan Octavian Hume, who also was theosophically involved. So you have this anti-colonial component of theosophy, while at the same time a lot of ambiguities. Someone like Besant, for instance, would understand colonization as a kind of necessary step to elevate this fallen culture, basically. So yes, that is a very Orientalist idea. But that is all that means that we have to look very carefully and very closely at the sources and really carefully contextualize them and select our sources not only with Western theosophists in mind.
Yeah, so we know that when it comes to the perception that we have in the Western world of Indian traditions and even other Asian traditions like Daoism and Buddhism and even Japanese traditions, there has been a massive influence from Theosophy. And I was wondering if you were to summarize in a nutshell what this influence is. I mean, what is the perspective and the lens that Theosophy has provided to the general culture and the general perception of Asian traditions? What would it be? And then the second question is, were the Asian traditions also influenced by Theosophy in the way they articulate their practice and they conceptualize their own practices?
So this metaphor of entanglement wants to express that, basically, that dynamic. It's not just one side influencing the other, and it's not just a ping pong, but it's a metaphorical tangle. This is why I like this metaphor so much. It really tries to capture the complexity. So yes, it was not just one side influencing the other, but mutual. And since Theosophy and of course also the subjects that they engaged with are so diverse and so heterogeneous, it's impossible to give one answer to this question. What is the main influence on the perception? But I'll do you the favor, but I'm going to complicate it immediately. Religious universalism, I would say that is really the one thing.
In terms of perennialism, you mean perennialism?
Well, that's a distinct thing. So again, like if my life depended on giving you one example answer, I would give
it
you that.
doesn't. You can also give multiple ones.
But let's. I think that is really significant. Not in the sense of perennialism, because that again is linked to certain authors that are kind of doing their own thing and that very often hated theosophy. That's another can of worms to open, but it's not in what you usually understand as the perennialist or traditionalist sense. But of course, it is related to, let's say, the literal meaning of perennialism, which means through the ages. And that in itself, this notion of, for instance, philosophia perennis, that is actually pretty ancient one. So the idea that there is a core, a hidden core common to all true, usually that's qualified religious traditions. So it's an ambiguous universalism as well, because usually there's also a hierarchy. But I would say that is the main thing, but that is not exclusively theosophical, quite the other way around. The Theosophists were actually taking this idea from a broader context, from also a deeper historical development. This exchange between these Bengali intellectuals, for instance, that I mentioned since the 18th century, that is a major reason for this idea. And this program, let's say, of comparative religion as it emerged around 1800, so we're a bit back in time again, that was actually significantly stimulated by Bengali perspectives. And those Bengali perspectives, in turn, derived to a significant degree from Persian learning, from Mughal learning, that was the, let's say, the educated court culture of that region at the time. But it also is heavily tied into understandings of Dharma, of discussions and cultural exchanges across Asia for hundreds of years, basically. So these notions never come out of nowhere. But the one important thing to avoid actually replicating a universalist perspective, if that is what you want to do from a practitioner perspective, for instance, you might not want to do that, but from someone who works historically as a religious studies guy like myself, like I want to avoid that. And the crucial thing to do that is to carefully contextualize, which again does not mean that when we have in the sources authors identifying, for instance, one of my favorite sources is François Bernier. That's a French doctor who in the 17th century was traveling in India, especially in Bengal, who was at the court of Dara Shikoh, who was the son of the emperor at the time, and who was one of the siblings who got then axed by Aurangzeb, the famous emperor. It's that period. And he was basically traveling with the entourage of this prince, and he recorded how he observed what he called the Kabbalah of the Sufis and the yogis. So he had this in comparativist theory, you call this tertium comparationis. Let me perhaps explain that briefly. Let's say you have oranges and lemons, and you are comparing oranges and lemons because they are citrus fruits, right? Or they are roundish, perhaps, or they smell nice. I don't know. But you need something to compare them. Like every act of comparison always works with this tertium, which literally means third, like with the third that you need to compare. That's also the old question of religion, like are we using a European religion to compare? It's one of these cans of worms. But in this case, his tertium is Kabbalah. Isn't that awesome? So he has some kind of notion that historically has nothing to do with, what we would identify as Kabbalah now from a historical perspective. But it was an established notion at the time to signify that they're doing weird and secret stuff. So he was using this Iberian, Jewish, often called mystical term, and he does call it mystical as well in the source, to compare these other mystics, as he called them, namely the Sufis and the yogis. And then he goes on to compare them to the European friars, as he calls them, the religieux, which doesn't simply mean religious people, but basically members of a religious order. And so we have this act of comparison, and it does not mean that this is historically accurate, that the Sufis and yogis were actually practicing Kabbalah. That is not my conclusion. But we see how historical actors made these comparative acts in history, and we can then look at the sources, contextualize, analyze, interpret, and come up with an explanation for that. And one aspect that kind of, and interestingly, got lost in the study, like in Western esotericism, in that particular niche, is secrecy. Because if there is one thing that emerges from all these sources, it's an emphasis of secrecy, which is why it's always very often paired. If you have esotericus, then very often you have something arcanus or something like that, or like a secretum, a secret, or it's emphasized that it's internus, as opposed to like a broader teaching available for a larger public. That is the one thing you always find in the sources, and that is the one thing that is entirely absent in most conceptualizations of Western esotericism. Coco von Stuckrad would be the most known exception. And of course, there's recent scholarship. Susanna Crockford focuses a lot on also the ambiguity of secrecy. Hugh Urban, who isn't really Western esotericism, but who has a lot of overlaps and engaged with that field too. Like he does a lot on secrecy, but it's completely absent from the Fevrian typology, which was heavily phenomenologist in several ways. And from the rejected knowledge in Western culture narrative, completely absent. And that is also interesting because we have, in esoteric Buddhism, for instance, like an accepted knowledge that, of course, esoteric means secret. And then, of course, they argue, and these the experts on esoteric Buddhism, then they argue because, of course, they have disagreements, and is it
secret, or is also secret and heretical?
Well, let's say, is it secret to begin with? The first sentence of a massive and quite admirable handbook on esoteric Buddhism that kind of has several of the leading scholars on the subject begins with the sentence that esoteric Buddhism is by far the most widely geographically spread kind of Buddhism. Tantra in Bengal, for instance, that is not marginal, it's not rejected, it's not something subterranean. There is, of course, the aspect of antinomianism in some respects, but also in very complex ways. But what I want to get is, it's not really secret, I mean, of course you have initiations, of course you have exclusive groups, but very often that's ambiguous, and very often this notion of secrecy is very orientalized, very like mystified, if you will. It's like, oh, oriental secrecy and stuff like that. Whereas in practice, it might be a lot more public, a lot more mundane, if you will, a lot more transparent. So the secrecy is ambiguous. And what does not work at all is rejected. I think there's a lot of convincing arguments why also in the European contexts, it is more often than not misleading to present it as rejected knowledge categorically. That's a subject of its own. But let's stick perhaps to the Asian context, where it doesn't make any sense at all. Like, it's not rejected knowledge. And the interesting thing there is that you have to contextualize very, very, very carefully to unravel all these ambiguities. Of course, in certain tantric traditions, in certain understandings, certain practices of Tantra, there is a ritualized transgression of certain societal norms, for instance, norms of purity, but in a highly ritualized and limited way, which is a difference to the more intentionally and more exclusively antinomian way that people then from Europe, North America, for instance, have engaged with these practices, focusing, for instance, on what may be perceived as transgressive sexual acts, whereas in the Indian context, it's not that your intention is not to be, like a kind of anarchist or like a subversive to society. Maybe some people are. Of course, there are always all kinds of interests. But the reasons for this antinomianism in the ritualized context are profoundly philosophical, very complex, and not targeted on pleasure or trying to be cool or something like that.
Yeah, it's not hedonistic.
Yes, and the actual practices are, in fact, really not super pleasurable at all.
No, they're more disgusting than anything.
Well, that's a matter of perspective, but the intention is certainly not hedonism.
Yeah, no, I wasn't thinking about the sexual practice. I was thinking about other tantric practices that that I've read about that, are very against the taboos of the Indian society and could be perceived as very unappealing to most people, I would say.
Yes, yeah, indeed. And then it's always a question of context. Like, is something hidden really? Is something really secret? But it does play a role. That's a crucial point. Again, as the religious studies guy, my point would not be to say, "Ha, I found you out. You are not really secret." My point is to try to understand how the secrecy is negotiated within a concrete historical context. Speaking as a historian, of course, you can do that from the perspective of ethnology, sociology, and so on as well. And there's great scholarship on that, by the way. But yes, also in the Western context, not only is it not categorically rejected, the question must also be, even if you can reasonably say it's rejected in a certain constellation, why is it rejected? Is that some kind of mainstream conspiracy against esotericism or something like that? Probably not that easy. Things may be rejected for all kinds of reasons, and also in certain contexts, whereas in others they are not. Someone can be intentionally antinomian, intentionally marginal, elected marginality. That's a term coined from a more sociological perspective. So it can be nice that you can be part of a subculture. You can say, like, I don't want to be mainstream. Like, I want to represent these antinomian ideas, for instance. But if you recall again this tale that I told about the Orientalists in the 18th century and how they were actually Orientalists, not simply Freemasons, and so on. Like, if you have a narrative like that, if you have a historical context, then you have to be very careful. You have to look, okay, what is the exact position of that historical actor, and then you will find an army of professors, theologians, famous philosophers, scientists discussing these things, esoteric and local. That's not marginal. That's not rejected even. I mean, things are always rejected. Like some of my theses are rejected. That's the point of scholarship. It's our job. There's always contestation. But what we must avoid are catch-all, overly simplistic, identitarian narratives. And that is a trap that people fall into very, very easily. And I think in that respect, also, global approaches can help us a lot to complicate things. I
like how you say to complicate things as in a good thing, to do something good.
Of course, it's a good thing. That's what I said earlier. I'm not interested in simplicity.
Oh yeah,
and there's a simple reason. There's a simple reason for that. Reality is not simple.
Yes.
That it's as easy as that. Like, you can come up with the sexiest, streamlined narratives that catch the attention of many people and say, oh yeah, wow, I totally subscribe to that, and that is now my identity or whatever. It's not going to reflect reality. It's going to shape reality, of course. And there are more than enough obvious examples for that. That's how politics works. You want to present simple narratives. You want to convince people. You want people to follow you by giving them easy solutions and easy explanations and this one narrative that explains everything. But that is, it's not faithful to the sources or to, let's say, really in the broadest sense, reality. The closest we can get to that is to always try to grasp complexity. That's my conviction.
Yeah, obviously I agree as an academic myself, but I like what you said, that that complexity represents reality and simplicity shapes reality. Can we summarize it like that?
Yes, I like that. Thanks. I'll steal that condensed statement.
That's fine. I also find it funny because Andrew pointed out what would be a tantric ritual for me, eating pizza with pineapple. Yeah, that's a forbidden taboo thing for me as an Italian. So that would be a proper tantric.
I've seen a pizza with spaghetti on top once. How does that make you feel?
Very uncomfortable.
But then you have to realize that there is eventually no difference between anything. Not between
yes,
pizza
I know.
and spaghetti
Exactly.
either.
That's the point of Tantra in reality. You know, the engaging with taboo substances and taboo behavior is about acknowledging the fact that everything is one and going beyond the repulsion and the attraction that we tend to have in our day-to-day life.
Yeah, of course, there are also very different and heterogeneous things that we subsume under Tantra. But yes, that especially that specific understanding of Tantra, that was really catalyzed in the 19th century by the people who I wrote my book about. So that's also a very Bengali thing, and like a version of Tantra, if you will.
And speaking of Tantra, I know that a lot of people who follow my channel are very interested in the left-hand path. So can you tell us more about the left-hand path and how the, that concept entered the esoteric discourse?
Yeah, I mean, there is a corresponding term, Vamachara, which does not really mean what left-hand path came to mean in this, let's say, modern esoteric context. The reason why it got associated with antinomianism so much, with then even Satanism at some point, is the circumstance that basically inner Indian polemics, but also polemics by missionaries and orientalists, were leveled against Tantra because of these, for instance, cremation ground practices and sexual elements, the consumption of impure substances. So it was said, oh, that is the worst degeneration, and it's abhorrent, and it's devil worship, and black magic, of course. That was the theosophical conception on the part of someone like Blavatsky when this whole exchange happened, that it's black magic. So there was kind of a mapping of white magic, black magic, versus right-hand path, left-hand path. It doesn't work like that historically. But you do have these ritualistic transgressions as part of what can be translated as left-hand path. And certain actors were then especially interested in this transgressive aspect, in this anti-social norm aspect, and highlighted that, and basically took this idea to the extreme as well. Some people who said, oh yeah, that is Satanism. If that is the same as devil worship, an entirely subject of its own again, but let's just put it that simply. Yeah, that is something satanic, something really against society, against especially Christian norms. And that is a development of its own. It has something to do with Indian traditions, but it's a reinterpretation, a renegotiation within concrete context, which is not to delegitimize it, because I'm also not convinced by these clear distinctions between, oh, something is authentic and something is not authentic. Again, that is the religious studies perspective. I'm not out there to tell anybody what they should practice or believe. But if you want to make the distinction between historical practices and present-day understandings of left-hand path, there's quite a gap between that.
Could you tell us more about the traits that differ from the Vamachara tradition, the left hand in Tantra and the left hand in the Western understanding?
Yeah, three perhaps major examples, and this is generalizing. There are very different understandings of left-hand path and Tantra, of course. So what I say might not map on what some people might expect or agree with. But let's say in the Western context, you would have a hedonistic element. You would have a position that we don't believe this perceived Christian negation of the flesh and so on. No, we want to embrace that, including sexuality. That is not the point. Perhaps for some it was, but it's not the point of historical tantric practice. Another example would be, you don't really want to transgress social norms because you feel like that's the right thing to do. In historical forms, always quote unquote, that might come from this philosophical position of realization that there is no such thing as pure and impure, or that you can make use of certain energies if you do it in the right way and get siddhi, these extraordinary powers. I promised 3 aspects. What was the third one? Antinomianism and the hedonistic. Let's stick with the 2, because this is also a never-ending subject. The point is, it's not about enjoying stuff. It's not against society or so, historically speaking. That would be major differences. But there's, of course, yeah.
Sorry, you were saying? I don't want to interrupt.
No, please. It's...
No, I was saying, I think that now there is a bit more awareness about these differences and the fact that the perception that has arrived in the West of Tantra is very different from what it is and was in India. And I think as the last question, I'd like to ask you about the role of mesmerism in the reception of these Asian traditions?
Yeah, that ties again immediately into this orientalist aspect, because so mesmerism became quite popular in the years around 1800, and it was immediately related to an interest in Indian practices and teachings. For instance, notions like prana, that were then related to subtle energies, to occult forces, which was an established natural philosophical idea, that there's occult qualities to things, occult forces. Obviously there is, from that perspective. If you think of magnetism, for instance, you have two magnets, or like a magnet and a piece of iron, and there's clearly some kind of either attraction or repulsion. So that's a force that isn't green or yellow, or so you can see it, but it's there. You have occult properties, occult qualities. A certain herb doesn't have an effect printed on it, like a little piece in a package of meds, but the quality is not obvious. It's hidden. It's occult. And these ideas were then, of course, very much popular when mesmerism was supposed to instrumentalize these occult forces, like animal magnetism, for instance. Different kinds of mesmerisms. They were quite different concepts, but they were related very extensively to especially Indian practices, because again, the idea was that ancient wisdom came out of India. So this old ancient wisdom from India, of course, it had to do something with science, and now modern science in the form of mesmerism was rediscovering this ancient science. Very, very widespread idea at the time. It was linked to magic as a natural explanation for magic. Not thinking of it in terms of, for instance, demonic versus angelic magic or something like that, but in the sense of magic as the use of natural forces. So Orientalism, Orientalist studies. So when I say Orientalist studies, I don't necessarily mean the capital O Orientalism. So Orientalist studies, mesmerism, reception of Indian doctrines, practices, those really went hand in hand. And one of the articles that you find in the description that you kindly refer to, which I hope will be out also pretty soon, that revolves around a French Jesuit in the late 18th century who lived in Beijing for over 40, 50 years, and who was good friends with learned Chinese. And in that context, learned about mesmerism and started to interpret Taoist practices and Kung Fu, as he called it, as a mesmerizing technique. And he did not simply do that as a projection of this Orientalist idea, but in exchange with his Chinese friends, which led him eventually to conclude that these Chinese practices are actually superior to mesmerism, because again, you have this narrative, modern mesmerism is just a superficial rediscovery of something that has been more profoundly understood already 4,000 years ago in that case. And I just give you this one example where mesmerism functions as a matrix for interpretation of cultural practices. And there's that wonderful passage in a correspondence that he had, by the way, with the guy who then wrote about tarot, and that in turn was one of the major sources for Eliphas Levi when it comes to tarot. It's linked to that.
Coeur de Gébelin, I think. Was
Yes.
it Coeur de Gébelin?
Coeur de Gébelin, that was one guy. He corresponded with two. Like there was another guy called the Comte de Meillet. And he corresponded with both. So that's actually quite mind-blowing that he did that to begin with. But that basically led to him writing at some point, I have been walking around for decades here, and I have looked at these weird practices, and now that, and he puts it like that, I have been initiated in the science of mesmerism. I now understand these practices. But he then goes a step further and says, this actually is not enough because mesmerism doesn't really get it. The guys who get it, those are the Chinese. And that is such a wonderful example of cross-cultural interpretation and, as I call it, translingual practice. Well, I don't call it, I take up this notion from a linguist, literary studies, Lydia Liu, where translation is not understood as I'm translating something from point A to point B. You know, I don't draw up a list like in the past centuries of corresponding words or something like that. I try to understand the historical context that made a translation possible without assuming that there can be a direct 100% identical translation that is always correct or something like that. You know, it's about the historical context. And that is part of this global historical perspective. I'm not so much interested in, you know, identifying wrong and right translations or interpretations. I'm interested in the exchanges themselves, in the historical context that allow us to explain, to understand what was happening, and then also build some theories on top of that. You know, like what does that mean for intercultural exchange, for translation, for religion, for esotericism, for practice, for these kinds of ideas. Also, of course, materiality and so on. That's not so much my shtick because I'm a text guy, but all kinds of approaches can work with that.
Yeah, that is very fascinating. Thank you for answering that. And thank you, Mark. Oh, I was trying to put you on screen. Thank you, Mark, for the super chat. And I'm glad as well that you caught us live. So I guess that these were all the questions and all the things that I wanted to discuss today. Is there one last final thing that you want to address that you feel people should know when it comes to understanding the matter of Asian traditions from a global perspective?
Oh, I think we have brought up so much. If there is more interest on the other side, I think that would be a lot more interesting at this point.
And where can people find you or your work, should they be interested? Obviously, everybody check the info box because you will find the publications that we've talked about and a link to Julian's book, Global Tantra. So in case you're interested, you will find the link in the info box.
Thank you for that. I'm quite.
Do you have social media? You're not very social. So you're not
I'm not a big fan of social media, to be honest. I do have a Twitter account that I use like every 3 months or something like that. So,
do you have an academia.edu?
Yes, I was about to say that. So I try to upload all my stuff except of the monographs on Academia Edu in some form or another. Sometimes that's what you call a preprint or postprint. That is basically still the Word version of the word processor, but already through peer review, and it's going to be published with that wording, but with different pages and so on, of course. I either do that or I just upload the normal thing. So, and of course, you can just Google me. I have a department website. You can email me. I'm happy to send you my stuff.
That's why I usually tell people that academics are generally very keen on sharing the knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, that's the job, isn't it?
Yes, but yeah, for everybody, most people must have heard me saying that a lot of times, but academics often have a page on academia.edu, and Professor Strube also has it. So if you want to read his publications, you will find them there, and you will find more to come, the forthcoming ones. So you should also follow him.
That's what I usually post on Twitter.
So thank you so much, Julian, for being here and for sharing with us your vast knowledge on the subject.
Well, thanks for having me. That was a lot of fun. I very much appreciate it.
Oh yeah, that was amazing, and I definitely look forward to seeing you in at the next SUI conference in
Yes,
Malmo.
that's
What's the
yeah.
right pronunciation?
I
Malmo?
think Malmö.
Malmö?
I'm not
Okay.
sure. Probably the Swedes are laughing at me now. But yeah, I'm looking forward to having overpriced Scandinavian beer with you.
Yes.
But delicious one. It's very expensive, but yeah, that's actually a vicious circle. Always have to get more of it.
Yeah. So let me wrap up the live stream and then we can have an after chat.
Let's do it.
So for everybody who's been here up until this point, thank you. Thank you so much. And whether you're seeing this live or if you're seeing this after we've been through the live, don't forget to smash the like button if you like this interview. But why wouldn't you? I don't know. And share this video with your friends, subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and leave me a comment so that I know what you thought about this video. And also you can ask questions that I can answer to and also engage the community. Other people may also have the answer to your question. So thank you so much for being here and stay tuned on Angela's Symposium for all the academic fun. Bye for now.